Socialist is going to speak some more about Hugo Blanco, in particular about the book, because she was very involved in editing the book, We the Indians, which should be read in conjunction with this book, which I mentioned before. The links will come out by Derek Wall.
Yes, so the first thing to say, which I've already said to some people that I've spoken to informally before we start, is that you've heard the bad news that Hugo isn't here tonight and won't be here this week. The good news is that despite the hostile environment, he has actually got a visa. He got his passport back last night, and the visa's valid from the end of April, so we will be bringing him to Britain probably at the end of February. So if everybody makes sure that they leave us their details, we'll make sure that you know when he actually is going to be speaking in London. I'm still very disappointed that he's not here now, because I've been really looking forward to spending time with him and having discussions with him. He's a completely exceptional person. I want to say something about my relationship with Hugo and how it's evolved and changed over a long period of time. I first heard about Hugo when I became involved in far-left politics in the mid-1970s in Britain. And at some point in those first years, I read his first book, Land or Death. And I guess I saw him as a fairly typical Latin American guerrilla figure, somewhat analogous with Che, who was also a bit of a hero of mine. He was a peasant leader, and in those days I knew that the struggle over land was important across much of Latin America, but I didn't really think about the implications of that and the extent to which that was very different from the political situation that we were operating in Europe. I remember hearing him speak at a big rally in central London at some point in the 80s. And I was hugely impressed by the power of his oratory. I could certainly imagine him as an organiser. I could imagine how he inspired people to listen to him and to be inspired by what he had to say. And it's certainly the case that even if today people are more likely to follow his writing rather than his speaking, he's involved in the production of a regular online and sometimes published periodical called Lucha Indigena, which is distributed throughout the Spanish-speaking Latin American world. And what he has to say remains very compelling. People who have a look at We the Indians, which we have on sale tonight, or quotes from him elsewhere, things that he's written elsewhere, or reads Lucha Indigena, his writing is incredibly vivid. I think one of the important factors in the power of his writing, and it's something that Derek Wall brings out very strongly in the biography, which is hot off the press today, is the tension between the fact that he obviously has a huge number of stories to tell. He's been involved in politics on an absolutely incredible pace over decades. And yet, he rarely talks or writes about himself. He's certainly one of the most unassuming people you could ever meet. It's not just a question of his personality, although there is an element of that. It's also that for him, the collective is at the centre of everything. So, there's a section in We the Indians where he talks about the fact that he has more than 9 lives. And he tells you all the stories about how he's escaped from death, usually at the hands of the Peruvian state. But the way he does it is not to say me, but us. because he always draws the comparisons between what's happening to him and what's happening to other people involved in the stories. One of the examples of that, again, comes out in Derek's book, and it actually comes out in a way that you might not notice if I didn't point it out to you, because it's on a photo caption. So, Hugo, as Dave says, is now 85. When Hugo was 80, he went back to the area of La Convención de Lares, the area where he was involved in building the peasant unions which successfully fought for land reform. And people knew that he was coming, and so they decided to organise a celebratory march in his honour on his birthday. And he found out about it before he got there, and he was really annoyed, and he said, "You can't call this just a march to celebrate Hugo Blanco. It has to be a march that is led by all the people who are still around that were involved in the leadership of that struggle." And I thought that was just very typical of the sort of person he is. When he last came to Britain in 2010, I was privileged to spend some time with him. Not only in public gatherings where we spoke on platforms together on a couple of occasions, but also spending some time with him on a one-to-one basis. Despite his limited English and my even more limited Spanish, we were able to have some good conversations. And it was in those discussions that I was able to understand for the first time the way environmental questions permeate so much of his thinking. It was around that time that Socialist Resistance agreed to publish an English version of We the Indians, which by that time I think had 2 Latin American editions. It's since had a 3rd, and they're in the process of producing the 4th. I agreed to edit the English language version. It was a complex but hugely rewarding process. And one of the reasons that it was complex is because in the English version of the book, we haven't translated it all into English. There are some words that remain in Spanish, and even more challengingly, there are a whole series of words that remain in Quechua, the language of the indigenous peoples of that area of Peru, of which I had 0 words when I started writing the book, and I still have not very many. But the whole question of language and culture is something that Hugo talks about a lot, and I think one of the most compelling bits of We the Indians for me is a series of letters that he wrote, and I'm sure I'll pronounce his name wrong, to José María Guedes, the Peruvian indigenous writer who was a huge inspiration to Hugo. And Arguedas was in a big political battle with somebody who more people in Britain are likely to have heard of, Vargas, who is a big neoliberal novelist who completely trounces indigenous cultures. And there's a really powerful section of the book where Hugo takes the side of Arguedas and explains precisely why it is that the West knows about Lossa and not about Arguedas, because it's all part of colonialism and seeing indigenous culture as being worthless. I'd always been fascinated by pre-conquest civilizations in Latin America, particularly the Incas. And I guess in Western culture, Western thought, there's some grudging acknowledgement that those societies must have been a bit technologically developed, so, you know, some sort of admiration for the extraordinary pyramids that they built. But I knew nothing about the relationship of those societies with the land. And that was the most significant thing that had changed for me in my political development from when I first sort of looked to Hugo in the 80s as this sort of remote guerrilla figure, and when I actually got to talk to him, because the whole question of eco-socialism had become central to my politics. And in Hugo's writings, I discovered much that's led me to understand the way that Indigenous communities have much to teach us about how and why to stop destroying the planet. And I'm going to end this presentation with some quotes from Hugo, because he says it much better than I can in terms of the challenges we're facing today and what those early societies have to teach us about how we need to relate to what Hugo calls Pachamama, Mother Earth. So he says, the inhabitants of the Andes felt great respect for nature, for Pachamama. We're not referring to the non-use of agrochemicals, which didn't exist, but to other aspects, such as the care for the arable soil, by making terraces known as andenes, leaving fringes of grass on the hillsides to contain the earth, giving canals a certain course so that they cause less land erosion, making the furrows on the hillside with the necessary inclination depending on the degree of rainwater, so that the rain erodes the smallest possible quantity of soil. And some of these techniques still exist, and indeed I can testify to that, having seen sites where those terraces had been excavated, and you can see that over centuries the infrastructure still exists. He goes on later, during the Inca period there was, and there now still is, a full understanding and use of biodiversity. An average-sized community had one group of people raising alpaca in the uplands and another cultivating cocoa in the low parts. When a community member is asked what his land produces, he answers proudly that it produces complete. He is indicating that it has various ecological terrains. As a boy, I took potatoes from the high ground to exchange for tuna from the mountain streams. As a youth, I exchanged cocoa before the empire ordered the sacred leaf to be exterminated from the forest edge for cured meat and cheese from the cold mountains. And later he says, the modern inhabitants of the forest have been hugely influenced by their ancestors' culture. They knew how to build their houses on stilts so that they were not affected by floods. They learned from them how to eat the palmito, the heart of palm, the yucca and the pijayu. They memorized how to prepare the quintessential forest drink, the masato. They knew how to sail on the Amazon's rivers. They knew the healing properties of many of the plants. And lest you think that it's just in We the Indians that he has this much to say about the environment. In Derek's book, there's an interview with Hugo that was done in 2017, where Derek asks him, you know, what's your main political activity today? And after talking about the production of Lucha Indigena and why the magazine itself is so important, he says, my fight now is for water. I'm also with the Amazonians who fight in defence of the rainforest, which are the lungs of the world. I'm also against agro-industry because it practices monoculture that is impoverishing the earth, because they put chemical fertilisers on the land. They use insecticides and herbicides that are killing nature. They do not worry about killing the land, because after killing the land cultivated here, the multinationals can go to Asia and Africa to continue killing the land. They also produce for export, growing artichokes and asparagus that suck up a lot of water, taking away the water that should be for the indigenous people of Peru. So I very much look forward to being on a platform with Hugo when he comes in April, and to continuing the struggle that he's been part of inspiring me to for many decades. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have got 10 minutes or so now for any questions or contributions regarding Hugo, Peru, or anything like that. If anyone wants to ask a question or make a contribution, you're welcome.
Have you been in Peru and in the collective work with them?
I've been to Peru, but I went to Peru before I met you, well, before I knew Hugo, so unfortunately I didn't go and see it. Yes, I was there 2008. 9. Thank you. My darling's over there.
One thing I was in, or two things really. One is that in the book, towards the end of the book, somebody mentions Hugo and says, well, the interesting thing is that if you look at that generation that grew up in the 70s from Latin America, just like here really, and differently, a whole number of those leaders have gone over to the right to become part, not necessarily all to the far right, but gone over to be incorporated into government initiatives or become either very reformist or even worse. And what's interesting about Hugo is he's not done that. Earlier in the book as well, he talks about the way, and this is a classic thing in Latin America, when they have these land reforms that are sponsored by the state, usually in order to head off a more radical development, which is what actually happened in Peru, was in La Convención and Lares. They made a real land reform, but it was controlled. It was controlled by the state at the end. And the government were very keen to get Hugo on board to be part of the official institution. But in the book it explains he refused to get involved in that because he knew it was important to keep this notion of the independent struggle and the leaders of the presence not being incorporated in that way. I thought that was very significant. If you look at the whole history, even from now we see Nicaragua with Ortega and all that team of people have gone even worse, much to repression of the left movement. So that's a very interesting phenomenon, I think, the fact he's maintained that. And the second thing I think is interesting about it is what Terry mentioned, which is this refusal of Gaudismo, this idea that there's these charismatic leaders, because that's another thing that is indelible, not just in Latin America, but here as well. If you think about a few people, Galloway, for example, people who think that they're the solution. Mélenchon in France, for example, the same thing, that they incarnate the destiny of the working class and peasants in some way. And he's always resisted that very effectively, I think. I think these are, so in other words, Hugo's life and struggles aren't just important, I think, for comrades struggling in Latin America, but I think internationally there's an awful lot in there. And in fact, to finish, I mean, I think these points that Terry was making about the indigenous community's values and relationship to the earth, that resonates, I think, with a lot of, particularly young people today in Europe, about their relationship to our society. I mean, just the numbers of people who become vegetarian, for example, today, young people, that sort of thing. I think that there's a real scope for sort of propagating these ideas in Europe, because there is a relationship, it's all connected, it's not just something that's sort of a romantic idea of Latin America. It really does resonate with people. There's a link between, if you like, people buying the asparagus from Peru and the state of the world. I think that link is being made more and more. Okay. Unless anyone else wants to say anything or make a contribution, we can. Oh yes, go.
To say that the issue with land and connection is very deeply tied in with native languages of that area, so it's going to be Quechua, isn't it? And also the violence against women is off the scale in Peru and Bolivia and quite a few of these other countries that have been very influenced by Catholicism. And what you're seeing further up in the Americas with the Native American women and Canadian Native American women, they are leading the movement to recognise the violence against women as violence against the earth. So this is very, very tied in with Christian doctrine, the Catholic Church, all these patriarchal religions where the missionaries have gone around and used violence to impose that on people. I mean, the very religions themselves are violent because they tell you that you're born with sin, that if you don't do what they say, you're going to hell. I mean, the whole thing is violent. So I don't know what Hugo's saying about, you know, I don't think these conversations can take place without recognising that, really. And it's not a competition between men and women, is it? It's just the balance of the feminine, whether that's represented by whatever vehicle that energy is represented in. It's the balance is completely corrupted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if there's much in the book about the current situation in Peru and current struggles, because I feel that the situation at the moment in Peru is still really, really bad, especially with sort of multinational takeover of indigenous lands, mining problems, and real severe poverty, especially in the countryside. And it's worse than it. I mean, when I talk to my ex-in-laws in Cusco and in La Convención, they say it's worse now, and they have less land now than back in the 70s. So I wonder if he talks about that and what he sees, how he sees Peru now in the present, and what he sees for the future in Peru as well.
I'm not sure quite enough has been said about his refusal, the visa refusal. I mean, for example, people may know, Hugo spent a long time in the 60s under death sentence, and there was an international campaign that eventually led to him being pardoned, and obviously he's still alive. So, and one of the things they asked for in the course of attempting to get the visa for him, which has been going on now for 3 weeks, is could he provide documentary evidence of his pardon? Documentary evidence of his pardon, which actually he refused to accept anyway. So he refused to accept it anyway. But that is one of the things. That's one of the things they demanded. So it is a very nasty little piece of racism that they've been conducting here. The other thing is that I think if you had to pick something that is Hugo's sort of what is the main point of his life. The main point of his life, I think, is to show the potential of indigenous struggle globally, potential of indigenous struggle. Because in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, eco-socialism in the global north, existed with heroic individuals, battling to defend an eco-socialist worldview. But in the global south, it was different because Hugo always says that the indigenous people have been eco-socialists for hundreds of years. That's what he says. Now, that might be a little bit there, but there's something very profound about it, and it comes from Pachamama, as Terry says, and that is that their starting point is a connection with nature. That's where they start from. So that's why in Canada at the present time, you've got First Nation people are in the front line against tar sand exploitation and pipeline building exploitation. There is a natural. It is natural for them to struggle on that, and so it is a very important thing that he struggles for, and I think that he is an absolutely tireless fighter for the environment. That's what he is. Absolutely tireless. That's where he really starts from, and what he sees as the potential of indigenous people. And it does come out. It does come out in these books. I wasn't personally quite convinced it came out quite enough in the first one, but it does come out in these books, and it's a very important thing. If we're facing an ecological apocalypse, if we're going to have an answer to that, we're going to have a socialist answer. We're talking now about an eco-socialist answer, and this is a very big factor in the development of an eco-socialist approach to the situation.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. Terry's just going to, Terry's going to just sort of quickly come back and then we'll pass on to us anyway.
Okay, so first of all, on the hostile environment, I mean, on the visa situation, yes, I mean, I agree with that, and I mean, I couldn't believe it when we got this, or he got this thing from the Home Office, or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office actually, about his pardon. I mean, this is particularly extraordinary given the fact that and you can see that it is the hostile environment because he came here in 2010 and didn't have those questions asked. So, we've seen the impact of the hostile environment on the Windrush generation, but it's clear, and the more I talk to immigration lawyers, it's clear that it has an impact throughout the globe, and it's also the case that I discovered that bit of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has been outsourced to India. So and again, that seems to be the case in lots of parts of the world, that you're not actually dealing with real human beings on the ground, you're dealing with, somebody sitting in a call centre thousands of miles away with no idea of the politics of the place. However, he has at least in the end got a visa, so he will be here. But Alan's absolutely right on that. On the point about violence against women, yes, I agree with a lot of what you say. There's not as much as I would like about it in the book. But one of the things that the book does, in With the Indians, there's actually more in the bio. Derek managed to get more out of him. But one of the things that the book talks about, as well as the role of the church, is the whole role of the feudal system and the remnants of the feudal, and the way that actually the whole of the peasantry is treated as the owner's property. And some kind of attitudes to women that we would see in Europe as being centuries out of date still persist in the relationship between the way the landowners, their attitudes to women. But of course it's true that one of the most exciting things that's developed in the whole of Latin America in the last decade and more, in response to the growth of femicide, is the most massive women's movement. I don't have much sense of how much that's impacting in Peru, but certainly in countries like Argentina, in Brazil, as I'm sure Marcelo will talk about shortly, the women's movement has been absolutely central to the revolt against Bolsonaro, and I don't doubt will continue to be so. And I hadn't really thought about what you were saying about the relationship between violence against women and violence against the land, but I think that is a very interesting thing. The book doesn't have very much to say. I mean, With the Indians is a collection of stuff that was written. I think the last stuff was written in the 80s. So it's a translation of things that he wrote in the course of the struggle. The other thing is he actually isn't living in Peru and hasn't been living in Peru for some time. He's living in Mexico. So he's kind of more interested and involved in, I mean, it's not that he's not interested, and you know, he does go back to Peru every so often, but he's kind of not involved in the struggle in a day-to-day sense. But certainly one of the things that struck me when we were in Peru in 2009 was the absolutely monstrous way that and this is true in other parts of the global south, like India, just grotesque, like a cement factory, where is it, La Arroya, which is it's just, they've kind of cut holes in the side of the Andes. I mean, it's just grotesque. And we think people in Europe don't have a sense of the way development is so brutal in most parts of the world. And of course, it's the poor people, and what you say about people losing land in that situation, and also rivers being poisoned and all of that stuff. So yes, the whole question of solidarity with these struggles is something that we shouldn't forget. But I hope I've done enough to convince you, those of you who haven't got both of the books, to get a copy, and I'm going to get out the list for myself.
So we're going to swiftly move on to